Hi, my name is Alana Guthrie and this is my presentation on the intersection of child safety and domestic violence. So as professionals working in child protection, it's extremely common to work with children who have been exposed to domestic and family violence. Domestic violence often intersects with child abuse by children witnessing the abuse, which can be direct, as in seeing the violence, or indirect, as in hearing the violence. Children may be forcefully involved in the abuse by the perpetrating parent, which is often the father. Children may be physically or verbally try to intervene to protect the victim parent, often the mother, or by help-seeking behaviours such as calling police, seeking help from a neighbour. So current legislation differs with respect to recognition of the overlap of child abuse and domestic violence. The Child Protection Act 99, Section 9 defines harm as any detrimental effect of a significant nature on the child's physical, psychological or emotional well-being. The harm can be caused by physical, psychological or emotional abuse or neglect, or sexual abuse or exploitation. Harm can be caused by a single act, omission or circumstance, or a series or combination of acts, omissions or circumstances. Domestic violence is not specified as a type of child abuse in the Child Protection Act. However, domestic and Family Violence Protection Act 2012, Section 10 clearly defines child exposure to domestic violence as the child seeing or hearing domestic violence or experiencing the effects of domestic violence. Child harm is also stated in Preamble 9 of the Act, which states that children who are exposed to domestic violence can experience serious physical, psychological and emotional harm. The Family Law Act of 1975, 4AB, also recognises child exposure to domestic and family violence, with the definition overlapping with the definition provided in the Domestic and Family Violence Protection Act. So as we can see, there is a gap in current legislation in terms of the recognition of child victims of domestic violence. According to the Australian Bureau of Statistics 2012 Personal Safety Study, 1 in 3 Australian women have experienced physical violence since the age of 15, which they're still a child. 54% of women who have experienced violence by a current partner had children, with 31% of these women believing their children were witnesses. In comparison, 61% of women who had experienced violence by a former partner had children, and 48% of these women believed that their children were also witnesses. A report by Richards in 2011 acknowledged the difficulties in obtaining accurate data on domestic violence, on children's exposure or involvement. A report by Our Watch in 2014 found that this may be due to women and children not disclosing the violence or abuse, the abuse not being recognised amongst family, friends or in society, with the difficulty in reporting due to dependence on abuser. So, research shows that children living in households where domestic violence is occurring are more likely to experience emotional, physical, sexual abuse, and are more likely to have developmental and behavioural problems, which increases their chances in experiencing social and economic hardship as an adult. Ander et al. 2006 talks about adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. They conclude that a greater number of ACEs, which include domestic violence, is correlated with more stress and traumatic events being exposed to. This has a negative impact on the brain development of the child, which can create developmental delays, impact on their coping and emotional regulation, and their behavioural responses to stress, as well as impacting on their attachment to their caregivers. As outlined in the previous slide, the outcomes for children that have been exposed to ongoing violence include disruptions to their cognitive and social development, as well as their attachment to caregivers. As we've seen with the families that we work with, many children experience depression, anxiety, and further violence or re-victimization as an adult. A study by Blair et al. In 2015 showed a correlation with depression, anxiety, and aggressive behaviours in boys exposed to DV, and Melter et al. 2009 also found that exposure to DV correlated with conduct disorder in a lot of children. As we can see, all these reasons why it's so important for intervention to occur and for why children need to be protected from further exposure to domestic violence. As we have experienced as workers in the field, difficulties can arise due to differences in workers' understanding of domestic violence, the complexities of domestic violence, and the impact it can have on children long term. As outlined by Humphreys in a 2010 study, failures in child protection workers not having adequate understanding of the complexities often result in women being responsible or being seen as responsible for the protection of the children by either leaving the home with them or by stopping the violence in some way. Humphreys felt that this was an inappropriate ultimatum that children may need to be separated from their mothers as a result of their mother's failure to protect. The ultimate focus on child protection is the child's safety. However, this does not take into account attachment and the harm that comes with breaking attachment between the child and their caregiver, which is most common the mother, who is also the victim to domestic violence. Parents need to demonstrate a willingness and ability to protect children from harm. However, this can fail to recognise the dangers and complexities involved in leaving a perpetrator of domestic and family violence in order to protect the children. Again, the onus is on women to do this, to leave the home and to risk the dangers of having to leave. Another challenge is the different legislations. The Child Protection Act stipulates the safety of children as paramount, and the decisions are based on the victim's safety, which is the child, whereas the Domestic and Family Violence Protection Act identifies both the adult and children as victims of domestic violence that are in need of protection and support. So it almost looks like the safety of the child versus the idea of the safety of both the parent and the child to enhance safety. There have been cases that I'm sure we've come across where child safety may consider children safe in the care of the abuser. This may occur in the case where the victim has mental health issues such as post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, anxiety, as a result of years of abuse by the perpetrator. Due to this, children may be reunified to the abuser if they are not demonstrating further violence and are able to parent their children on a level that's considered good enough. This can result in the victim feeling further victimised and let down by the system. Some further challenges. So these include not involving fathers if they do not want to be involved in the intervention, which ultimately allows fathers to opt out and avoid accountability, as well as the challenges around trying to support mothers to have their children in their care in order to build attachment again. This can be particularly challenging due to housing and financial difficulties, as women who may have been dependent on their partner may be isolated from informal supports and have to rebuild their lives in independence. It can also be difficult for women who have experienced complex trauma due to the abuse, who may have ongoing mental health issues including anxiety, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder. All these issues compound on providing safety and stability for the child, which is ultimately the goal for a lot of support for mothers who are escaping violence. And these are all things that we can do in our daily practice, advocating for fathers to be more involved in interventions, to be more accountable, and to support women in a holistic approach in order to protect their children. So what makes good practice across services? Douglas and Walsh stated that positive working relationships between child protection and the mothers who are victims of domestic violence is extremely important in ensuring good practice. And child safety needs to be more supportive of mothers escaping violence and keeping the children in their care, or reunifying the children to their care. Betty and Goddard in 2007 also felt that an integrated, collaborative, holistic response to education and preventing children from domestic and family violence exposure, and more interventions to address trauma experienced by the child. Timely and targeted therapeutic interventions to support children and adult victims, as well as knowledge and application of attachment between the mother and the child, as well as in cases where the attachment between the child and the perpetrator is seen as important to the child. Again, this all comes down to information sharing, collaboration, integration, and coordination, and looking at holistic approaches that really are in the best interest of the child and keeping the child safe from further harm. Thank you very much.